I recognize the member from Toronto-Danforth.
Vice Speaker, thank you so much, and happy Monday morning. There are a number of things to talk about in this bill, and I know my colleagues have addressed them earlier. There are some real causes for concern around the attacks on green development standards, and there is a very strange exemption for Metrolinx from provisions of the building code. And given the difficulties we've had with Metrolinx in my riding, the idea that they're no longer going to be covered by the building code is a pretty odd thought, and I will be curious to hear how the government justifies that. There are a number of concerns here around housing affordability. This bill does not legalize missing middle housing options as of right in all neighbourhoods. And if you're concerned about making low-cost housing available quickly across Ontario, this would help tremendously. I'll note recently, I believe it was the Mayor of Markham who used his strong mayor powers to block this kind of housing. So no thanks to the government in making it more difficult for people to find a place to live. This bill continues, or the government in this bill continues to rely solely on the for-profit private market for delivery of all new housing, as if the collapse in developing housing in Ontario can be fixed with a tweak here and a tweak here and a change to development charges. I don't think it's a bad idea to reduce the cost of building new housing. In fact, I think it's a really good idea to reduce the cost of building new housing. Go to my earlier comments about missing middle and making it possible to build fourplexes all over the place. But the reality is that people who earn minimum wage are not going to be buying $1 million, $1.2 million homes. Not going to happen. The government needs to actually step in and have a housing agency, as we have had historically, to build housing for those parts of the population, and they are large, who do not actually have the purchasing power to participate in the market. That's something that this government needs to address, not addressed in this bill. And frankly, one other huge affordability issue that needs to be addressed is real rent control, so that people who are living in rental housing in my riding and many others who are facing continuous increases in their rents, to the extent that people have said to me, and I had an 80-year-old come up to me at a meeting in an apartment lobby late last year and just said, one more rent increase and I'm out. I can't afford to buy groceries and pay rent in this fairly modest rental building in my riding. And she said, so do you have government housing options for me? And I had to say to her, it's a 10 to 15-year waiting list. And her response was very simple: I'll be dead. So this government is not addressing the needs of a big chunk of the population who aren't going to be buying new houses, and it isn't addressing the needs of those who want to and may well be able to buy a new house by actually taking the steps necessary to change regulations in this province. Now, a few other comments. Seamless transit is a good idea. I take transit a lot. I've used the GO train to get out to Oshawa. I've used it to get out to Ajax. I've used it to get out to Mississauga, to Hamilton. I think that investing in more transit makes a lot of sense. But I don't think that a minister-controlled fare hike with no accountability is a good idea. How is the minister actually going to determine what is a fare hike? Will the minister actually look at things in terms of affordability? Will the minister actually look at things in terms of the sustainability of the transit entity that he's dealing with or she's dealing with? That giving of power without accountability is not a reasonable or thoughtful approach to the problem that we're facing. Putting money into transit? Absolutely. When Mike Harris cut funding for transit back in the 90s, it had an immediate and obvious impact on the TTC. Can't speak to other transit systems because I don't travel in transit in Hamilton and Ottawa, but I did see it in Toronto, and my suspicion is that transit systems all over were hurt badly by that withdrawal of funding, not being restored, not being addressed in this bill. The environmental standards for new housing and the attack on the efforts of local governments to actually do something about affordability, about the cost of operating those homes by reducing their energy needs, the efforts of local governments to reduce emissions so that we deal with climate change are being undermined by this bill. And I find it weird that this government effectively has abandoned action on climate change. As you're well aware, it's abandoned its targets on greenhouse gas reductions. Now, am I totally surprised? I'm not, because I knew they weren't going to make their targets, notwithstanding the statements of the Minister of the Environment in this House. But the reality is that the climate crisis is there and things are deepening. For those who care about bottom lines rather than the impact on people, it is having a huge impact on insurance across North America. Insurers are withdrawing from jurisdictions where the impact of climate is making homes effectively uninsurable. So California, Louisiana, Florida are jurisdictions where there are areas that cannot get insurance. And in those states, state governments have set up insurance companies that I have to say are deeply underfunded. We are facing in Northern Ontario a problem with people getting insurance because of the increase in flooding that is again happening because of climate change. So we are seeing increased costs. This is a real phenomenon. This is a government that has responsibility for looking after the people of Ontario and is not paying attention to a fundamental issue that will determine the kind of future that we have. And going from water, I'm going to go to fire. The reality is that as the world gets hotter and as the interior of continents gets drier, we will see more fires in cities. You saw the fire in Los Angeles well over a year ago. That was a wake-up call to everyone. We'd seen the fires in Fort McMurray, in Jasper, Lytton, British Columbia, burned to the ground, but we hadn't seen it in big cities. You should all be well aware that the wildfires that we've seen in places like Australia a number of years ago, wildfires that produced enough smoke that in Sydney, the fire alarm, the smoke detectors and the interior of office buildings started going off because of the concentration of smoke from the outside coming into those buildings. That is substantial. The World Bank runs a website on risk, and in that site, they look at fire risk in cities around the world. Toronto is listed as a high-risk city for urban fire. That is something people need to consider. It wouldn't have been a high-risk city 30 years ago or 50 years ago, but the world is hotter. It is drier. And thus, the potential is there for a fire breaking out in a wooded area going into an urban area. Halifax in 2023 had that problem. 165 houses lost. I talked to one of the firefighters who was on the scene. They drove their truck into the area. The glass on the fire truck shattered from the heat. That week, a number of firefighters, after the fire was out, retired. We didn't sign up for this. So we have a substantial problem that is in motion right now and is deepening, and yet this government is going after every measure it can that actually will try and address the problem. So the government's tried before to get rid of the green building standards, and it's sort of like whack-a-mole. They hit it, didn't really work. They hit it again, didn't work. Maybe they'll be successful this time and knock it out. But that is a real disservice to the people of this province. It raises some very substantial questions. What has the government got against, what has this provincial government got against local governments trying to make housing more efficient so people have lower energy bills? I mean, the reality is, if you have a higher standard of insulation, if you seal a house properly, you will need less fuel, less energy to heat it and to cool it. So why don't we, in fact, require that standard so that in the long run, people's costs are lower. It's much cheaper to make a house efficient when you're building it the first time than to go back and try and retrofit it later. A number of you are well aware of that. You also are well aware, I'm sure, that 70% of our natural gas comes from the United States. So the more gas we burn, the more we are subsidizing a government, a country that is actually trying to undermine our economy. When we hire Canadian workers to insulate our homes, upgrade the windows at time of construction, make buildings more weather-tight, we are putting Canadian workers to work and reducing the amount of money we send to the United States. Why is the government against that? Why is the government against that? I mean, they could make the argument that we'll get rid of these city standards and we'll have an Ontario building code that brings about the same result. That would give you a uniform standard. But that is not what is proposed before us. And then I have to ask, who is asking for this? Who is saying, hey, get rid of these green building standards? We want to pay more for heating and cooling. Who, in the end, is asking for that? Because it does not help the vast majority of Ontarians who will rent or own a home that could be efficient, weatherproof, and hopefully far less expensive to operate. If you look around, you'll find that the green building standards in Toronto have not slowed down development. Toronto has seen increasing or consistent housing starts since its green development standards were introduced 16 years ago. 16 years ago, and you're trying to roll it back now? Seriously? I mean, we do have a decline in housing construction. It's not because of a 16-year-old standard for energy efficiency and weatherproofing in a house. So if the province wants to step up and set a standard that will protect people from climate change, it will protect people's pocketbooks from higher energy bills, bring on those regulations. But that's not what is happening here. What we're seeing is a rollback to increase the heating of the world, increase the risk, increase the cost of insurance, and make home ownership more expensive, home renting more expensive. Now, if the government is not that concerned about the homes and their standards, then I want to go on to this whole question of safe drinking water and water corporations. I found it interesting that this initiative was coming forward, and I found it useful that there was enough political pressure that the government has said, no, these will be publicly owned water corporations. It sort of reinforced that language. But I was here when Kathleen Wynne took it upon herself to privatize Hydro One. And you can just see the steps of setting up a corporate structure with shares that can be sold that allowed one to move step by step to eventually taking it out of public hands. And that is my worry about what we see with this bill. I appreciate the fact that, again, political pressure has made the government make a variety of statements about how, in fact, these private water and wastewater corporations won't be privately owned. But you have to ask, why on earth are you doing it in the first place? And when you have in the text of the bill that the ownership of shares can only be with a level of government or an agent of that government, you have to ask, how is an agent defined? Because if you appoint an agent, I don't know, let's say Imperial Oil, to run your water, and they decide to run it on a basis that is contrary to your interests, are you going to overrule them? Are you going to actually have a de facto operation that delivers the same results as a private corporation with a window dressing of public ownership? So I have real questions about the government's intentions here and what exactly is driving them. I'm also concerned about the communal water systems. And I can see some utility, particularly in small rural northern communities, where a communal water system could be useful. But I have to say, you have to be very careful here, because you have to wonder whether or not those water systems will actually be subject to the protections of Section 19 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was recommended by Justice O'Connor. The proliferation of those communal water systems necessitates the updating of many source protection plans under the Clean Water Act, and I don't see any provision in the bill to do that. I don't see an apprehension that, in fact, we might put ourselves in another Walkerton situation. That is a substantial concern. And you also have to ask, what's the long-term financial viability of these communal water systems? And how does one assure that the actual operation is at a level such that those who drink that water will be protected? That is a substantial concern. And I can also see, because I accept that these systems can be useful for small, rural, northern places, that given human ingenuity, they can also be used to facilitate sprawl. And if you're concerned about the affordability of government or the affordability of housing, facilitating sprawl is not your friend. So that is a real concern for us. My hope is that in committee we'll actually get an opportunity to dig into this further and hopefully make some amendments that would put us in a position where the bill would be beneficial to the people of Ontario. And so there are a number of amendments, obviously, Speaker, one of which being either drop the attack on green building standards or make sure that the Ontario Building Code reflects the highest possible level. And I did leave something out. Now, the member for Guelph remarked on this. The attack on requirements for charging for electric vehicles is quite extraordinary. The world is going to electric vehicles in terms of technology. If you want to be building tomorrow's product, you want electric vehicles. And if you want a market for electric vehicles in Ontario, you need to have the charging capacity. So if you take away that charging capacity, you undermine people's incentive to buy electric vehicles. You undermine your industrial future. Why would you do that? Who does this serve? And I just find this bill to be contradictory in the way it's set up, contradicting statements of the government around its commitment to future manufacturing by undermining the conditions that are necessary to make that future manufacturing viable. We are going to need committee hearings on this bill. Now, the custom in the last year has been far fewer committee hearings. I don't know what the government is currently planning. My hope is that they will have committee hearings and that the public will have an opportunity to come, present information, be questioned, and, although they won't get answers, at least raise questions that may be substantial in the way people assess where things should go with this bill. One of the things that I hadn't mentioned earlier and I want to mention now is that reducing development charges will or should make housing less expensive. Depends on whether or not the builder is charging at what the market will bear or charging at what it actually costs the builder to put a house in the ground. But if you reduce development charges which are collected by cities, the cost of putting in place the infrastructure doesn't disappear. So effectively what you do is say to cities, you will now pay for this infrastructure that previously was paid by the new development. And cities will be pushed to have property tax increases. So this government says we don't raise any taxes. That's right. You farm it out. You put the pressure on lower levels of government, and in the end, they're the ones who are forced to raise taxes so that the roads are paved and the infrastructure is there for new development. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the bill. There's a lot here, but I covered as much as I could. Thank you.
Questions? Questions? I recognize the member from London North Centre.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend, the member from Toronto-Danforth, for his ever-eloquent presentation on Bill 98. He spoke about power without accountability. In Metrolinx, we see that there are now 124 vice presidents, which has been revealed through a scan of the Sunshine List. It's the same as the number of members of provincial parliament for the entire province of Ontario. It's up 5% since last year. You know, having a bloated, top-heavy, and arrogant administrative overload such as this is really siphoning money away from the core mandate of Metrolinx, which is really to get people to their location faster and more effectively. My question, though, is what does it say about the Conservative government that they have allowed Metrolinx to become this bloated and this top-heavy?
The member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I thought the Freudian slip about overlords was entirely appropriate. And I urge you not to correct your language, sir. I think it simply reflects the culture of the government. As people are aware, the Premier has, I think, the largest Premier's office in history. And you have to ask, why? I mean, seriously, why? If the Premier's operating with some efficiency, he shouldn't need a larger bureaucracy than Liberals have. And let's face it, the Liberals were very generous with themselves. Very, very generous with themselves. Do you need to be more generous than the Liberals with your political staffing? I suggest not. I would suggest some modesty in this matter and going to a level that is defensible. And frankly...
Response?
Well, frankly, your comments are well put, sir. Thank you. Overlords indeed.
Question. I recognize the member from Parkdale High Park.
Thank you so much, Speaker. Through you to my colleague. We know that Metrolinx has been plagued with well-documented concerns, ballooning executive ranks with unusually high number of vice presidents, a pattern of costly delays, decisions that have too often disconnected from the communities that the transit was meant to actually serve. And at the same time, like in my riding of Parkdale High Park, we're not asking for luxury announcements or glossy press releases. We're asking for reliable, accessible, affordable transit. So my question to my colleague is this. How does, if it does, the Metrolinx section of Bill C9 actually improve accountability and deliver better transit, rather than simply reinforce the same top-heavy structure and decision-making that has led to the challenges in the first place?
The member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, that's a puzzler. I don't know how it actually does, in fact, make things better and more accountable. I know this may sound strange to some members of this legislature, but ensuring that government operation is as close to the population it serves as possible makes a lot of sense to me. And so the idea that the TTC had its downtown relief line taken away from it, and the Ontario line put in place, raised serious questions. We were told the Ontario line was being put in place, that it would be done faster than the relief line. Well, the relief line was going to be underway shortly before, about the time this government came into power, and instead of having transit from the East End to downtown in the mid-2020s, we're looking at closer to the mid-2030s. I don't see that as being responsive to the needs of population. And so I would say that structuring things so that accountability is lost and power is vested at a much higher and much less accountable level is a huge problem. I don't see this bill actually correcting that.
Question. Question.
Hamilton West, Ancaster Dundas.
The member from Hamilton West, Ancaster Dundas.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding public transit and the fare integration that this government is talking about. I will just say that in one of the things that municipalities struggle with, of all the downloading that they have to deal with from the province dumps all the costs on municipalities and expects them to deliver expensive services like public transportation. One of the things that we have been saying is that the government needs to actually take back, upload the 50% cost of running public transportation. But now instead we're going the opposite way. And with this minister's ability to integrate fares, but have no consultation with municipalities and no indication as to whether they can increase fares, whether local municipalities will receive additional funding to support this. Do you have any confidence that this government's meddling in public transit will improve things for the people trying to use that as an affordable option for getting around their cities?
The member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, that is a toughie. No, I don't have any confidence. I would say that I know the member is shocked by my response and by my apparent cynicism. But no, I don't think the government is going to be very responsive on this. And frankly, if they did care about transit and they did care about the impact on fares, they'd start putting the money back in. They would reverse the decision that was made by Mike Harris and actually put provincial dollars in a substantial way back into public transit and municipal transit corporations around this province. It would make for more affordable transit. It would make for transit systems that were better funded and thus better maintained. I would say that what we see here in this bill is, in fact, an undermining of that ability to make sure transit works well and make sure that transit is accountable to those who ride it.
Question? I recognize the member from Essex.
Thank you, Speaker. I have a question for the member from Toronto-Danforth about parkland dedications. A question about parkland dedication. So it could be a maximum of a 5% parkland dedication under the Municipal Act for planning purposes. Actually, I don't know if it's the Municipal Act or the Planning Act. But sometimes municipalities and developers have difficulty negotiating what portion of the development should be dedicated to parkland. Should it be that part? Should it be this part? Should it be something that looks like, along a river valley?